The public loved the doll family, but their fame hid a brutal human trafficking reality. Sold to the circus by their own biological parents, these four siblings with pituitary dwarfism were forced by the wrangling machine into lifelong cognitive imprisonment. Adults in their 50s were contractually mandated to wear toddler clothes, hold toys, and speak like infants just to secure ticket sales. This is the unvarnished truth of how a family bloodline and a corporation robbed four people of their right to grow up. The biological reality of hypopituitary dwarfism is a profound endocrine malfunction occurring deep within the architecture of the human brain. The pituitary gland, a pea-sized organ located at the base of the hypothalamus, catastrophically fails to produce adequate levels of somatotropin, the primary human growth hormone. The physical manifestation of this glandular failure is extreme. The skeletal structure ceases its longitudinal expansion early in childhood. The limbs, the torso, and the cranium remain perfectly proportional, but they are frozen in miniature. The individual is permanently locked within the exact physical dimensions of a human toddler. However, this condition is strictly a physical arrest. The neurological development of the brain does not stop. The central nervous system continues to mature at a standard biological rate. The neural pathways multiply, the cognitive capacity expands, and the individual naturally develops the complex emotional intelligence, the intimate carnal desires, and the sophisticated analytical reasoning of a fully functioning adult. This creates a terrifying, inescapable state of physiological dissonance. The victim possesses the mind, the maturity, and the agonizing self-awareness of a grown human being, but is trapped inside a physical vessel that society fundamentally refuses to treat with adult dignity. This was the exact biological prison inherited by four siblings, born in the small rural town of Stolpen, Germany, at the turn of the 20th century. Gustav and Emma Schneider produced a family of 7 children. 3 of these children grew to standard terrestrial proportions. The remaining 4, Gracie, born in 1899, Harry, born in 1902, Daisy, born in 1907, and Tiny, born in 1914, all inherited the hypopituitary mutation. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the birth of a child with a severe physical anomaly was typically treated in one of 2 ways by rural European families. The parents would either fiercely protect the child, hiding them from the cruel, superstitious gaze of the public, or they would abandon them to state-run institutions. Gustav Schneider rejected both of these standard societal responses. He operated with a cold, terrifying, and deeply sociopathic pragmatism. Gustav Schneider did not look at his 4 exceptionally small children and see vulnerable offspring requiring insulation from a hostile world. He looked at their stunted skeletal growth and recognized a highly lucrative, internationally exportable biological commodity. The sideshows and traveling carnivals of the era were highly profitable enterprises, entirely dependent on a steady supply of human anomalies. Gustav systematically identified his children's genetic mutation as the family's primary financial asset. He actively discouraged them from pursuing standard education, learning civilian trades, or developing any skills that would allow them to integrate into standard society. Bypassing standard childhood development entirely, they were systematically bred and relentlessly conditioned strictly for the rigorous demands of the global exhibition circuit. Their physical bodies were designated as inventory long before they reached cognitive maturity. The definitive execution of this exploitation occurred in 1916. The geopolitical landscape of Europe was violently tearing itself apart during the carnage of the First World War. Amidst this global chaos, an American amusement manager and sideshow operator named Bert W. Earls traveled to Germany. He was actively scouting for new human assets to import into the highly lucrative American entertainment machine. Earls encountered the Schneider family. He immediately recognized the immense untapped commercial potential of Harry and Gracie, the two eldest hippopituitary siblings. At this time, Gracie was 17 years old, and Harry was 14. They were not infants, they were teenagers possessing the clear cognitive awareness to understand exactly what was transpiring. A transaction was executed between the American manager and the German father. Gustav Schneider effectively sold the physical autonomy and the future labor of his own flesh and blood for cash. Operating far outside the boundaries of standard talent representation, this transaction functioned strictly as an act of human trafficking, heavily disguised by a thin veneer of entertainment management. Harry and Gracie were packed up and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. They left their mother, their siblings, and their homeland behind, arriving in the United States not as ambitious immigrants seeking the American dream, but as biological property. Their immigration status, their access to food and shelter, and their daily physical survival were now entirely legally dependent on the man who had purchased the rights to their bodies. The immediate non-negotiable protocol upon their arrival in the United States was the total systematic eradication of their past. The American entertainment industry required consumable, easily marketable brands, and a complicated German surname attached to a foreign identity was deemed a commercial liability. The surname Schneider was instantly annihilated. The siblings were forcibly rebranded with the surname of their buyer. They ceased to be Gracie and Harry Schneider. They became Gracie and Harry Earls. This renaming was a profound act of psychological domination and legal ownership. By erasing their family name, Bert Earls severed their conceptual ties to their biological roots and explicitly marked them as his exclusive corporate assets. They were no longer individuals, they were the Earls' property. Years later, in the 1920s, when their younger sisters Daisy and Tiny were eventually imported from Germany to join the lucrative American Act, the exact same protocol of identity erasure was applied. They were absorbed into the Earls brand, stripped of the Schneider name, and integrated into the Turing machine. The psychological violence of this branding eventually escalated to its ultimate, most dehumanizing conclusion. Following the death of Bert Earls in the 1930s, the four siblings adopted a new permanent stage name that completely codified their status within human society. They ceased operating as the Earls siblings and officially became the Doll family. Far from a harmless theatrical choice, the adoption of this specific corporate moniker served as the undeniable finalized declaration of their total societal subjugation. A doll is the ultimate symbol of inanimate compliance. A doll possesses no agency, no voice, no legal rights, and no internal life. A doll is an object manufactured entirely for the tactile amusement and psychological projection of towering adults and children. By actively branding four highly intelligent, fully mature adults as dolls, the entertainment industry achieved the perfect psychological imprisonment. It explicitly signaled to the ticket-buying public that these four individuals were not human beings deserving of adult respect, civil liberties, or basic dignity. They were breathing, moving toys. The industry effectively commanded the audience to look at a 30-year-old man and a 25-year-old woman and see nothing more than disposable playthings. The Schneider family name had been entirely eradicated, replacing four human lives with a highly profitable, deeply degrading corporate trademark that would bind them to the sawdust arenas and soundstages for the rest of their natural lives. The physical imposition of childhood upon a fully developed adult mind requires a meticulous daily regimen of psychological suppression. When Bert W. Earls assumed ownership of the Schneider siblings, he did not merely change their surname. He initiated a strict, uncompromising protocol of forced infantilization. The American entertainment market in the 1920s did not want to be confronted with the uncomfortable biological reality of mature adults trapped in stunted bodies. The audiences demanded the comforting, sanitized illusion of eternal innocence. They wanted living dolls. To satisfy this market demand and maximize ticket revenue, Earls engineered a highly specific aesthetic and behavioral cage for Harry, Gracie, Daisy, and Tiny. The primary instrument of this control was their wardrobe. Well into their 20s, 30s, and even their 40s, the siblings were strictly prohibited from wearing standard adult clothing. Their public appearances were entirely defined by the sartorial markers of infancy. Harry, a man with a fully developed prefrontal cortex, a deep understanding of complex financial contracts, and the emotional maturity of a middle-aged adult, was routinely forced into velvet sailor suits, short trousers, and oversized bow ties. Gracie, Daisy, and Tiny were dressed in ruffled pinafores, pristine white lace bonnets, and patent leather Mary Jane shoes. The props utilized in their acts were deliberately oversized to aggressively exaggerate their smallness, forcing them to interact with giant lollipops, massive wooden building blocks, and oversized rocking horses. They were frequently staged in a touring production of Hansel and Gretel, cementing their public image as wandering, helpless children lost in a fairy tale world. The conditioning extended far beyond their clothing. The siblings were subjected to rigorous vocal coaching. They were instructed to artificially raise the pitch of their voices, suppressing the natural, deeper timbres of their adult vocal cords. They were trained to giggle on command, to wide-eye the audience in feigned wonder, and to utilize the simplified vocabulary of toddlers during press interviews. The cognitive dissonance generated by this daily routine is staggering. Behind the curtain, Harry Earls smoked cigars, discussed travel logistics, negotiated performance terms, and processed the world with the sharp, cynical intellect of a seasoned industry veteran. The moment the spotlight hit the stage, he was required to instantly execute a humiliating performance of extreme vulnerability. To break character, to demand to be spoken to as a 30-year-old man, or to express adult frustration, anger, or sexuality was an absolute violation of their brand. It risked terminating their contracts and losing their only mechanism for survival in a country where they possessed no other marketable skills. They were biological hostages, forced to actively participate in the daily public denial of their own human maturation. The systemic enforcement of their infantile public persona generated a highly lucrative, heavily calculated legal paradox that effectively immunized the circus management from federal oversight. During the 1920s and 30s, the United States government and various state legislatures were aggressively expanding statutory protections against the industrial and theatrical exploitation of minors. Organizations such as the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children were actively shutting down exhibitions that subjected actual youths to grueling, hazardous, or prolonged performance schedules. The management surrounding the Earls siblings engineered a brilliant, entirely cynical administrative loophole to completely bypass these emerging labor frameworks. When state labor inspectors or child welfare regulators arrived at the circus grounds to investigate the exhibition of toddlers, the management simply produced the siblings' verified European birth certificates. These documents provided irrefutable legal proof that Gracie, Harry, Daisy, and Tiny were chronological adults, completely outside the jurisdiction of child labor laws. This documentation granted the circus absolute legal immunity. However, the exact second the government inspectors departed, the siblings were forced back into their ruffled pinafores and oversized baby carriages. The industry successfully weaponized their adult legal status to subject them to a brutal, unregulated industrial schedule, routinely enforcing 14-hour workdays, 7 days a week, across punishing cross-country train routes, a schedule that would have resulted in immediate federal prosecution and massive corporate fines had it been applied to chronological children. Conversely, the industry weaponized their physical appearance to deny them the standard minimum wages, union protections, and professional respect afforded to adult theatrical employees. They were trapped in the ultimate legislative blind spot, legally classified as adults solely to endure unlimited, exhausting physical labor, while aggressively marketed as children to maximize ticket revenue and suppress their compensation. The corporate machine expertly manipulated the American legal code, ensuring the siblings received absolutely none of the statutory protections of childhood, while simultaneously being denied every fundamental right of adulthood. This erasure of their adult dignity reached its absolute most disturbing apex when the siblings transitioned from the sawdust rings of the vaudeville circuit to the high-stakes, heavily capitalized soundstages of Hollywood. In the early 1930s, the American studio system was ruthlessly exploiting the public's fascination with the grotesque and the macabre. Director Todd Browning, operating under Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, began production on the pre-code horror film Freaks in 1932. The film was a groundbreaking, highly controversial project that utilized genuine sideshow performers rather than actors in heavy makeup. Browning's stated intention was to tell a story about the inherent humanity, loyalty, and morality of physically deformed individuals, contrasting their internal nobility with the cruelty and superficiality of the normal, standard-sized world. Harry Earls was cast in the lead role of Hans, a wealthy aristocratic sideshow performer who becomes the target of a murderous plot orchestrated by a beautiful, average-height trapeze artist. Daisy Earls was cast as Frida, his devoted, heartbroken fiancée who attempts to warn him of the deception. The casting of Hans and Frida reveals a sickening disregard for the performer's psychological boundaries. Harry and Daisy Earls were biological brother and sister. Fully aware of their blood relation, the studio prioritized economic convenience over human decency, forcing them to portray a romantically engaged couple. They were directed to hold hands, gaze with romantic longing, and simulate a matrimonial dynamic on camera. For the executives, the Earls siblings were not human beings with fundamental incest taboos. They were simply available, appropriately sized props. To refuse this highly publicized simulation of incestuous intimacy meant immediate termination and blacklisting. Trapped, Harry and Daisy swallowed their psychological revulsion and delivered the performances the studio demanded. The film Freaks ultimately destroyed Todd Browning's career. The public and the studio executives were horrified by the unvarnished reality of the performers, and the film was heavily censored, banned in multiple countries, and buried in the MGM vaults for decades. But while Browning suffered professional exile, Harry and Daisy Earls simply returned to the grueling reality of their captivity, carrying the quiet, unacknowledged trauma of their cinematic exploitation with them. This total lack of professional respect, individual recognition, and human dignity continued to define their relationship with Hollywood, culminating in the production of the 1939 cinematic monolith, The Wizard of Oz. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer required over 100 individuals with dwarfism to populate the massive Technicolor sets of Munchkinland. To fulfill this unprecedented casting demand, the studio contracted Leo Singer, a prominent European manager who operated a large troupe known as the Singer Midgets. The Doll family, already highly famous and established performers in their own right, were absorbed into this massive, undifferentiated block of human assets. The visual legacy of the Doll family in The Wizard of Oz is deeply embedded in global pop culture. Harry Earls, dressed in a bright blue suit and holding an oversized lollipop, is the central defining figure in the iconic Lollipop Guild musical sequence. He steps forward, executes a sharp, choreographed dance routine, and hands the candy to Judy Garland. Gracie, Daisy, and Tiny were similarly featured throughout the background and foreground of the elaborate Munchkinland sequences. Despite their crucial, highly visible contribution to one of the most famous and enduring scenes in cinematic history, Harry, Gracie, Daisy, and Tiny received absolutely no individual screen credit. The Hollywood machinery treated them with the exact same administrative indifference as they treated the rented lighting rigs or the painted canvas backdrops. They were not acknowledged as individual actors navigating independent careers. They were hired, processed, and managed as bulk cargo. The studio negotiated exclusively with Leo Singer, paid the manager a lump sum, and credited the manager on the final film print. The individual performers were heavily exploited financially. Historical records indicate that the studio paid the dog playing Toto a significantly higher weekly salary than the majority of the human beings performing in Munchkinland. The Doll family contributed their unique physical biology, their highly honed performance skills, and their total compliance to a film that would go on to gross hundreds of millions of dollars and secure a permanent, untouchable place in the pantheon of global culture. In return, their individual identities were entirely swallowed by the corporate machinery. When the production wrapped and the massive Technicolor cameras stopped rolling, there was no glamorous Hollywood premiere for the Earls siblings. There were no individual contracts, no press tours, and no residual royalties. They packed away the Munchkin costumes, stepped off the MGM lot, and were immediately tossed back onto the cramped, rattling train cars of the traveling circus. The glittering promise of the silver screen had proven to be nothing more than a highly illuminated extension of their original captivity. The transition from the sawdust rings to the Hollywood soundstages did not grant them legitimacy or adulthood. It merely amplified the scale of their exploitation, proving that whether they were in a rural circus tent or a multi-million-dollar movie studio, the world would only ever permit them to exist as nameless, interchangeable, and entirely disposable children. The absolute extraction of their dignity did not terminate when their Hollywood contracts expired. It metastasized into a highly publicized retroactive character assassination. In the decades following the release of The Wizard of Oz, a pervasive, heavily circulated mythology was manufactured by the standard-sized Hollywood elite regarding the behavior of the dwarf performers on set. Prominent figures, most notably Judy Garland during heavily syndicated national television appearances in the 1960s, explicitly characterized the entire cast of Little People as a chaotic, uncontrollable mob of deviant, chronic alcoholics who had to be routinely managed by studio police. This was a devastating, clinically false generalization that inflicted profound historical damage on the Earl's siblings. The unvarnished, documented reality of the Doll family was the exact antithesis of this manufactured Hollywood punchline. Harry Earls operated his family unit with a ruthless, uncompromising corporate discipline. He acutely understood that substance abuse and public deviance were the primary mechanisms that historically bankrupted and destroyed sideshow performers. The siblings maintained a strict policy of absolute sobriety and intense professional decorum during production, explicitly distancing themselves from the amateur, hastily recruited extras who lacked formal theatrical discipline. Yet the mainstream media apparatus completely ignored this factual, highly documented distinction. To generate cheap comedic anecdotes for late-night talk shows, the Hollywood establishment casually erased the Earls' decades of meticulous, self-managed professionalism. They forcefully grouped highly disciplined, financially autonomous adults into a fabricated narrative of infantile delinquency. This posthumous defamation definitively proved that even when the Doll family executed their contracts with flawless corporate precision, the terrestrial world would always prefer to consume them as a grotesque, undisciplined joke rather than publicly acknowledge their undeniable professional competence. The physical parameters of a human life dictate its psychological boundaries. For a civilian adult, the terrestrial world offers geographical permanence, which allows for the slow, organic cultivation of independent social networks, intimate relationships, and a multifaceted personal identity. For over 3 decades, the terrestrial reality of Harry, Gracie, Daisy, and Tiny Earls was entirely eradicated. They did not live in a town, a city, or a neighborhood. They lived on the massive, rattling steel spine of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circus train. This train was not merely a mode of industrial transportation. It was a hermetically sealed, highly regulated mobile containment facility. It spanned over a mile in length, a rolling city of canvas, animals, and exploited human biology that moved ceaselessly under the cover of darkness. jumping from rural rail yards to industrial sidings. Within this enclosed ecosystem, the doll family existed in a state of absolute, manufactured social isolation. The circus environment enforced a rigid, impenetrable hierarchy. The management executives occupied the apex, the standard performers occupied the middle, and the sideshow attractions, the individuals possessing severe biological mutations, were frequently segregated into specific, highly monitored living quarters. The Earl's siblings ate in the communal mess tents, slept in cramped, specialized train cars, and operated on a grueling, relentless schedule that completely consumed their waking hours. They were surrounded by hundreds of people every single day, yet they were profoundly, entirely alone. This mobile ecosystem effectively severed them from the normal civilian world. They could not join community organizations. They could not attend standard social gatherings. They could not interact with average-height adults in any capacity other than a transactional performance. When they stepped off the train, it was only to walk the short, heavily guarded distance to the exhibition tent. The general public was not a community of peers. The public was a massive, faceless entity that paid 25 cents to stare at their stunted bone structure. The neurobiological consequences of this prolonged isolation are devastating. Human adults require complex, varied social friction to maintain psychological health. Because the siblings were entirely cut off from civilian society, their social and emotional development was trapped in a highly toxic echo chamber. Their entire universe was restricted to their controlling managers, the paying audience that viewed them as biological jokes, and their own tightly knit, traumatized sibling unit. They became entirely dependent on one another for basic emotional survival, forging a trauma bond so thick and impenetrable that it eventually strangled any possibility of individual autonomy. The circus management actively cultivated and enforced this isolation. A unified, dependent sibling act was vastly easier to control and negotiate with than four independent adults possessing external support systems. The industry ensured that every peripheral relationship the doll family formed was ultimately tethered to commercial exploitation. This absolute commodification of human connection is brutally illustrated by a specific, highly publicized relationship the siblings maintained in the 1930s. Archival newspaper articles from 1936 enthusiastically reported on a couple residing in Memphis, Tennessee, who had publicly declared themselves the foster parents of the doll family. The press heavily circulated this narrative, framing it as a heartwarming tale of unconditional civilian love bridging the gap between the normal world and the sideshow. A strict clinical forensic accounting of this relationship destroys the sanitized narrative entirely. These foster parents were not benevolent civilians offering a safe harbor. They were concession managers operating retail stalls within the very amusement parks where the siblings were contracted to perform. The relationship was a highly calculated, mutually beneficial corporate grift. The Memphis couple utilized the title of mother and father to project an aura of wholesome domesticity over the sideshow act. This alleviated the psychological guilt of the paying audience. If the freaks were loved and cared for by standard-sized parents, then the act of paying to gawk at them was morally justifiable. In exchange for this narrative, the foster parents secured the exclusive merchandising rights to the doll family's image. They managed the printing, distribution, and sale of thousands of souvenir postcards featuring Harry, Gracie, Daisy, and Tiny. The affection was entirely transactional. The parental bond was a business model designed to maximize retail revenue at the concession stands. Even the most intimate, foundational human relationship, the concept of parental love, was weaponized against the siblings, utilized merely to extract a higher percentage of the gross profits. The siblings complied with the charade, posing for the photographs and smiling for the press, fully aware that the warmth of their foster home was entirely dependent on their ongoing ticket sales. The absolute most grotesque contradiction within their corporate branding specifically targeted the biological maturation of Daisy Earles. As she transitioned into her 20s and 30s, her endocrine system, while failing to produce longitudinal skeletal growth, successfully initiated standard female puberty. She developed the definitive, unmistakable anatomical markers of a mature human female. The circus management and promotional executives did not view this biological reality as a fatal threat to the infantile doll illusion. Instead, they coldly identified it as an opportunity to exploit a secondary, deeply disturbing, and highly lucrative demographic: the adult male voyeur. They explicitly and officially marketed Daisy under the heavy promotional moniker of the midget Mae West. This specific marketing strategy engineered a terrifying, schizophrenic, psychological prison, the exact same corporate machine that legally required her to wear ruffled pinafores, hold oversized lollipops, and simulate the helpless, high-pitched innocence of a toddler during the family-oriented matinee exhibitions, simultaneously weaponized her mature, feminine allure to aggressively captivate the evening crowds. She was forced to navigate a repulsive, highly lucrative intersection of manufactured infancy and adult sexual fetishization. The promotional departments lured audiences by implicitly promising the grotesque thrill of observing a woman who possessed the mature curves of a Hollywood sex symbol trapped inside the physical architecture of a child. Daisy was contractually obligated to constantly oscillate between these two violently opposing personas. She was denied the fundamental right to an integrated human identity, entirely fractured by the industry into two distinct, highly profitable commodities: the innocent plaything and the miniature seductress. The psychological exhaustion of sustaining this daily, bipolar corporate performance completely destabilized her internal boundaries. She was forced to actively commodify the very adult womanhood the circus officially denied her, proving that the industry would readily exploit any aspect of her biology as long as it generated a ticket sale. The crushing, suffocating weight of this closed loop eventually triggered a desperate, catastrophic psychological rebellion. The human drive for biological and social maturation is relentless, even when actively suppressed by a billion-dollar industry. In 1942, Daisy Earles attempted to shatter the containment facility. Daisy was 35 years old. She had spent decades dressed in ruffled pinafores, artificially raising the pitch of her voice and pretending to be a toddler. She had endured the grotesque psychological violation of simulating a romantic relationship with her own brother on the set of Freaks. She was aging, and the profound cognitive dissonance of her existence was becoming unbearable. Daisy Earles executed the most radical act of defiance available to her. She pursued a terrestrial civilian romance. She entered into a relationship with an average height, standard size man who operated entirely outside the orbit of the sideshow exhibition. In 1942, she married him. Beyond a simple romantic union, this specific marriage functioned primarily as a desperate, highly calculated declaration of her own biological adulthood and independence. By marrying a standard-sized civilian, Daisy was explicitly rejecting the doll family brand. She was actively demanding strict public recognition as a mature, intimately involved, fully functioning human female. She was attempting to sever the psychological umbilical cord that bound her to her siblings and the management executives. She was trying to step off the circus train and establish a normal, grounded, domestic reality in the terrestrial world. The attempt was doomed before the ink on the marriage certificate was dry. The systemic forces binding Daisy to her captivity were too deeply entrenched. The marriage collapsed in less than a year. The failure of this union provides a terrifying clinical insight into the absolute success of the circus industry's institutionalization protocol. Rather than simple romantic incompatibility, the rapid dissolution of the marriage exposed a catastrophic, unavoidable collision between two entirely incompatible physical and psychological realities. Daisy had spent her entire 35-year existence operating within a highly specific, aggressively monitored ecosystem. Her brain was wired to function within the hyper-vigilant, insulated dynamic of her brother and sisters. She had no practical experience navigating the mundane, daily logistics of the standard civilian world. Furthermore, the circus machine actively and aggressively sabotaged the union. The doll family brand was an immensely valuable corporate asset, and that asset required all four siblings to be present, compliant, and unified. If Daisy successfully integrated into the civilian world, the act would be fractured, and the revenue stream would be severely compromised. The management and the intense, suffocating gravitational pull of her own siblings exerted immense psychological and financial pressure on her to return to the fold. The cognitive friction between a standard private matrimonial bed and the highly public, infantilized existence she had known since childhood was insurmountable. Daisy could not seamlessly transition from being a piece of rented Hollywood cargo and a sideshow toddler into a standard suburban wife. The psychological architecture required to sustain an independent adult life had never been allowed to form. Her civilian husband, equipped only with standard terrestrial experiences, was entirely unequipped to dismantle the decades of severe psychological conditioning his wife had endured. The marriage fractured, disintegrated rapidly, and ended in divorce. Daisy Earles packed her belongings and returned to the rattling, windowless confines of the Ringling Brothers train cars. The termination of her marriage was the ultimate, finalized psychological defeat. It was the moment the machine definitively proved to the siblings that escape was biologically and socially impossible. Daisy had attempted to breach the perimeter, and the terrestrial world had violently rejected her, proving that she lacked the psychological tools to survive outside her cage. She resumed her place alongside Harry, Gracie, and Tiny. She put the pinafores and the lace bonnets back on. She lowered her physical stature and raised the pitch of her voice. She never attempted to leave the sibling unit or the circus ever again. The rebellion had been crushed, not by physical force, but by the undeniable, terrifying realization that the industry had successfully rendered them entirely dependent on the very system that exploited them. They were permanently locked into the closed loop of the sideshow. 4 aging adults hurtling through the dark on a steel track, moving endlessly from one exhibition to the next, waiting for their physical bodies to finally fail so the performance could end. While their inability to integrate into the civilian world was tragically absolute, within the confines of the circus industry, they were financially formidable. This independence was rooted in a critical legal maneuver Harry had executed years earlier. Following the sudden death of Bert W. Earls in the 1930s, the siblings faced a highly volatile legal vacuum. In the standard, heavily predatory architecture of the early 20th century sideshow circuit, the death of a primary manager did not automatically grant freedom to the performers. It typically resulted in the immediate transfer, renegotiation, or auction of the human inventory to a new corporate overseer. The biological assets were simply reassigned to maintain the revenue stream. However, Harry Earls, having spent 2 decades closely observing the ruthless arithmetic and the strict contractual mechanics of the American entertainment machine, executed a staggering, unprecedented legal maneuver. He completely bypassed the secondary management market and actively established a closed-loop, independent corporate syndicate comprising exclusively of himself and his 3 sisters. He formally and aggressively seized legal control of their own exhibition contracts. When the upcoming touring season approached, Harry Earls did not wait for the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus to assign them a new handler. He approached the massive corporate executive board not as a compliant biological anomaly, but as a hard-nosed autonomous talent agency representing a proven, highly lucrative monopoly, the Dahl family brand. By legally eliminating the middleman manager, Harry successfully eradicated the predatory commission structure that historically siphoned up to 80% of a sideshow performer's gross retail revenue. He recognized that the massive conglomerate possessed a total dependency on their specific, highly recognizable biological mutation to drive sideshow ticket sales. Harry weaponized this exact corporate dependency to secure direct, highly favorable financial terms. He demanded and secured a massive percentage of their gross earnings, strict control over their touring logistics, and explicit contractual boundaries regarding their daily exhibition hours. The corporate executives facing the potential loss of their most profitable sideshow attraction were legally forced to negotiate directly with the very individuals they publicly exhibited as helpless toddlers. This unprecedented contractual emancipation is the precise, unvarnished financial mechanism that permanently insulated the siblings from the catastrophic poverty, severe debt traps, and institutionalized starvation that claimed nearly all of their sideshow contemporaries. They successfully transitioned their status from rented biological property into a highly capitalized, self-managed corporate entity, proving that they possessed a deeper understanding of predatory American capitalism than the executives who originally purchased them. The human mind, when subjected to decades of total institutionalization, fundamentally loses the capacity to process unstructured freedom. In 1958, the physical degradation of aging finally forced Harry, Gracie, Daisy, and Tiny Earls to retire from the grueling, relentless touring schedule of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. For the first time since Bert W. Earls had purchased Harry and Gracie in Germany 42 years earlier, the siblings were not legally or contractually bound to a management entity. They possessed a staggering amount of accumulated wealth, having rigorously saved the wages that their managers had not managed to extract over 4 decades of global fame. They possessed the financial autonomy to buy absolute privacy, to disappear into a quiet civilian retirement, and to finally live out their remaining years as standard, unobserved adults. The transition into this theoretical freedom revealed the most profound, devastating manifestation of their psychological captivity. The circus had not merely dictated their schedules and their wardrobes, it had completely eradicated their ability to conceive of an identity independent of their exhibition. They did not know how to exist without an audience. The 4 siblings pooled their vast financial resources and purchased a plot of land in Sarasota, Florida. They did not buy a standard civilian home. They utilized their wealth to commission and construct a highly specialized, custom-built residence. Every architectural element, every structural dimension, and every piece of furniture within this property was aggressively scaled down to their exact physical proportions. The door frames were drastically lowered. The light switches and electrical outlets were installed just inches above the floorboards. The kitchen counters, the plumbing fixtures, the staircases, and the custom upholstered chairs were all completely miniaturized. They officially named the property the Doll's House. A clinical psychological analysis of this architectural project destroys any narrative of quaint, eccentric retirement. Instead of serving as a peaceful sanctuary, the Doll's House functioned strictly as a physical, brick-and-mortar manifestation of the exact psychological cage the entertainment industry had meticulously constructed for them over 4 decades. They had spent their entire lives being forced by circus managers and Hollywood executives to live in a child's world, surrounded by oversized props to emphasize their diminutive stature. When finally granted absolute freedom and millions of dollars, their neurobiology could not process a reality outside of that specific conditioning. They utilized their own money to permanently trap themselves in a miniature environment, explicitly rejecting the standard terrestrial world that had always treated them as profitable anomalies. The tragedy deepened exponentially. They did not retreat into this custom-built, miniaturized environment to find peace or to escape the staring eyes of the public. The exhibitionist conditioning was terminal. Shortly after completing the construction of their private home, the siblings opened the Doll's House to the public. They erected signage. They charged admission to tourists. They allowed towering, average-height strangers to walk through their miniature living room, to gawk at their scaled-down furniture, to observe them drinking from miniature teacups, and to take photographs of them inside their private sanctuary. This decision represents the absolute finalized triumph of their exploitation. They had successfully transitioned from being the managed assets of the Ringling Brothers to becoming their own managers and their own jailers. They voluntarily perpetuated the freak show. The psychological programming was so deep and the trauma bond so impenetrable that they literally could not conceive of an existence where they were not being looked at, judged, and consumed by the public for their physical dimensions. Their domestic life became their final performance. They had internalized the commodification of their own bodies so completely that they transformed their own living room into a commercial museum, continuing to charge a quarter to let the normal world validate their existence. The doll's house became the final permanent perimeter of their reality. The four adults, stripped of their original German surname, stripped of their adult dignity, and stripped of the psychological architecture required to exist in the standard world, locked themselves inside a meticulously crafted toy box. The demographic collapse of this manufactured ecosystem was slow, silent, and relentlessly chronological. They died exactly as they had lived, collectively isolated from the civilian world and surrounded entirely by the physical architecture of their own lifelong exploitation. Gracie Earls, the eldest sister who had been shipped across the Atlantic in 1916, was the first to succumb. She died within the miniature walls of the Sarasota house in 1970. The loss of a sibling within such a hermetically sealed trauma unit is catastrophic. The remaining three siblings simply tightened their perimeter and continued the routine. Daisy, whose desperate 1942 attempt at a civilian marriage had collapsed under the weight of her institutionalization, died a decade later in 1980. Harry Earls, the brother who had been forced by the Hollywood studio system to simulate a romantic matrimonial relationship with his own sister on the set of Freaks, died in 1985. With the death of Harry, the highly synchronized codependent unit was finally shattered. Tiny Earls, the youngest sibling, was left entirely alone. She inherited the massive, silent weight of the doll's house. For nearly 2 decades, she lived a solitary existence within the miniature rooms. She was the sole surviving relic of a bygone era of overt human exhibition. A woman whose entire identity had been defined by a group act that no longer existed. Tiny Earls died on September 6, 2004, at the age of 90. Her death marked the absolute extinction of the Doll family brand. The historical documentation of Harry, Gracie, Daisy, and Tiny Earls requires a brutal, uncompromising rejection of the sanitized nostalgia that frequently surrounds vintage Hollywood and the golden age of the American circus. The entertainment industry identified 4 human beings suffering from a profound, incurable endocrine mutation and coldly calculated that the most efficient mechanism for their commercial exploitation was the absolute lifelong denial of their psychological maturation. The profound tragedy of the Earls siblings is not located in the genetic misfire that halted their physical growth. The tragedy is that a capitalist society categorically refused to allow them to grow up. The system systematically attacked and dismantled their adult intellects, forcing them to perform an eternal, infantile gratitude for the mere privilege of being allowed to survive on the fringes of the spotlight. They were subjected to a multi-decade campaign of psychological mutilation that was so total and so flawlessly executed that the victims themselves ultimately built the very house they would die in, ensuring the doors were small enough to keep the real world out. The legacy of the Doll family stands as a permanent, haunting indictment of how modern society approaches physical and neurological divergence. It forces a critical examination of the system that demand marginalized individuals constantly perform vulnerability, innocence, and compliance to secure basic social tolerance. Whenever an industry, a culture, or a legal framework requires a human being to shrink their intellect, mask their adulthood, or commodify their trauma for the comfort and amusement of the majority, the architecture of the freak show is functioning exactly as designed. The true monster in the history of the sideshow was never the individual standing on the stage. It was the perfectly normal, average-sized society standing in the dark, eagerly paying for the right to watch another human being be erased.